Hey everybody, Shabbat Shalom, great to see all of you. Last night I spoke at length about Thanksgiving and American values, had some nice response. So as we begin putting things up on the Rabbi Finley channel, podcasting, that's up there, and I'll do a more refined version and put that up there as well if you want to see that talk, and it's something I think is very worthwhile. We're back to archetypal psychology. And before I begin, I want to share with you one of the finest introductions that I had to archetypal psychology. Explain a little bit again what it is, summarize my Shabbat thought very briefly, and then move into our Parsha. So this book, In Search, by James Hillman, was a book that I read in my first year of rabbinical school back here in the States. I was in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University. I came back and began rabbinical school formally in September of 1981. And one of my professors handed me this book and said it's a great book. It truly is a great book, and it's a book I've been reading ever since. It's published in 1967. James Hillman was a senior student of Carl Jung, of course, the founder of what is called archetypal psychology, analytical psychology, and so forth. And the embryo of the book is Hillman's many speeches and workshops to Christian clergy on the problem of loss of soul. And what Hillman was concerned with was that clergy, and I think here we're talking about non-fundamentalist, non-orthodox clergy, were ceding the idea of the soul to clinical psychology. And therefore, for a minister to feel that the minister could counsel well, they would take courses in clinical psychology and in many ways relinquish the idea of the soul, to the point that psychology, of course, has to do with a psychodynamic method to relieve inner suffering, but it rarely addresses the idea of the soul. It more addresses the idea of repression, trauma, talking therapy. Of course, then there's cognitive therapy, behavioral therapy. But the idea of actually addressing the soul more or less disappeared from Christian life, according to Hillman. And I would say even in Jewish life. So however you grew up, I remember in my conservative synagogue, I never heard anyone talk about the soul, even though we recite every time I went to services that you shall love God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might. But we never discussed it. Even friends of mine who became Orthodox, Baalei Tshuva, when I would ask them about the soul, they were very, very learned on halacha and keeping the mitzvot. But when I would ask them, so what does bechol levavecha, with all your heart, bechol nafshecha v'chol modecha, what does that exactly mean? I never heard a very deep discussion of it. Now, I was very fortunate when I was in college. I had my undergraduate degree is in religion, and we did cover Jung, and we did cover this idea, but we never actually studied Hillman or Jung in depth, and this was my really great introduction. And it launched me into, I think, everything that I've done since. It was a founding vision for Mirav and me in founding Or HaTorah. That one thing our synagogue would be is a place where the soul could be discussed, and it could be discussed in a deep and searching way, and that ultimately our founding vision would be that whatever we do, whatever we teach, of the many things that we do, it would be concerning the concerns of the soul. So let me just read just a tiny bit from Hillman. Hillman says, and I'll translate it into the modern idiom: the one who has lost one's soul will be finding God anywhere, up above and down below, in here and out there. The person will cling to every straw of love blown past the doorway as the person is waiting for a sign. Without some sense of soul, there will, of course, be vast confusion of morality, uncertainties of action, decisions logically sound, but not psychologically valid. And therefore, before psychology and religion quarrel over to whom the soul belongs, let us go in search of it together. So the title of the book is an ironic response to research. So when you look at the professions of psychology, every person with a doctorate knows they have to do extensive research on some kind of topic. cover the current state of publications, the relevant books, make some of case, and then have a thesis that demonstrates it. So you might say that the study of clinical psychology has a strong research dimension. Not that it shouldn't. I'm very much in favor of people mastering their field. And of course, there are many, many gifted psychologists who go far beyond method and do reach into people's souls. But what Hillman is saying is, as much as there are psychologists that reach into souls of people and become soul guides, religion has abdicated its responsibility to be concerned with the realm of the soul. Now, why is this so important? I'll refer a little bit to the tragic news of the week and then go to my theme. I'm sure you're all aware of the tragic shooting at the Walmart where a manager came in and murdered several colleagues and wounded many others and left behind a suicide-homicide note. And in the note, this person, from what I read in the newspaper, the person had several resentments against people in the staff that he said, and I doubt this to be true, but it might be true, that they had made fun of him, that they had ridiculed him, they had devalued him. Now, we all know from the barest understanding of the unconscious ego self, people can say very benign things to us, but because of pre-existent wounds in the unconscious ego self, we'll interpret them as slights, we'll interpret them as insults, and rage will be built within, which is a rage all of its own. The rage within has very little connection with the objective world outside, which is a very big part of the path that I formed under the title Wisdom Work. A very big part of this is whatever your feelings are, whatever is happening inside of you, one has to validate that with a rational understanding of the world. So, for example, with this tragic incident, if this person had a soul guide, if this person had someone who could lead them into the rage and pain in the unconscious ego self, maybe this person could have looked at himself and asked whether his feelings were connected to reality. He demonized the people around him, and I'm fairly certain these were not demonic people. The second disturbing thing I saw in the note that I'm sure many of you read is that the murderer who eventually committed suicide, what he claimed was he had an inner struggle. And he seemed to know that God was against this, but he had a sense that Satan was in him and that Satan won. Now, our term for that in Lurianic Kabbalah is the Sitra Achra, that there is a force within us that is opposed to our value system, values which come up out of the soul. And from a Hillman Jungian perspective, the shadow is the name of where this evil, these dark forces within us reside, but they're not extinguished. Even though we don't think about them, even though they're not part of our conscious mind, and certainly not our conscious sense of self, they don't go away. They percolate into what I will call out of the shadow into other realms of the unconscious. And I don't care to fully try to differentiate between the soul and the unconscious, although they are very related. They seep up then into what I'll call the unconscious ego self. They manifest into ego states such as rage, resentment, pain, etc. They begin to take over consciousness and they result in action. So when I asked myself what could possibly be done, and as I recall, we were talking about this back in the spring, early summer, the idea that for all the good that is done in a school, let's say in a high school, in college, for all the good is done, there's harm done as well. As you know, one of the greatest harms is an almost unconscious teaching of moral relativism, that there is no real right and wrong. It's just relative to one's subjectivity or culture or place in history. That's number one, although nobody really believes it in their actions. Meaning the same people who study moral relativism will go out and demonstrate for human rights. So there's a contradiction there that is hardly ever discussed. The second thing, and I know from having been in academia for, I think, a total of 20 years in one way or another, religion is marginalized. Religious people are considered to be intellectually inferior. Now, even someone in what I'll call liberal religion, such as myself, I'm not dogmatic. I don't believe that the Bible is the very word of God, although it resonates with holiness. Now, that discussion is completely read out of the academy. So what happens, a person can go through their entire high school career, their entire college career, and afterwards, and never have the soul brought up. Now, those who do attend church and synagogue, and I don't think it's changed since Hillman wrote the book, they're very rarely going to hear about the soul. They're not going to hear about the shadow. They're not going to hear about the profound existential struggles that every person has. They're not going to understand that sometimes the depression and rootlessness and ennui that we feel is concerned with the loss of soul. This discussion is never had. So from Hillman's perspective, Jung's perspective, and my perspective, many people go through life unfulfilled. The unfulfillment they know, the lack of meaning and purpose they know, but they've never learned about the soul. They've never learned that there's something, again, it's a concept. It's not something that we can empirically point to. You might say it's a kind of consciousness. It's a kind of reality that no other word properly describes. One can talk about the mind, that is not the soul. One can talk about the unconscious, that is not the soul. And that's where I think Hillman has given me a definition of soul that he first proposes in this book, and I'll repeat it. I remember his saying, soul is where events become experiences. Soul is where events becomes experiences, which means the world is interpreted. I'll add to that where meaning and purpose are formed, which has led to something that I've often said. Although I use the term to have meaning and purpose in life, but at a more experiential level, meaning and purpose have us. Once meaning and purpose are worked out in the soul, they make a claim on us. And the problem is, if we don't develop what I'm going to call a spiritually whole version of meaning and purpose, we don't have something in place. The shadow will provide it. The destructive forces in us will provide it. And when we see some of the tragic things happening in our country, it's apparent to me, and this would be my diagnosis of all the other reasons people say that people commit horrible crimes, random crimes against strangers. We're not talking about criminality over territory and drugs and resentments between people, but just the urge to murder as a meaningful act. By the way, when people talk about a senseless act of violence, no act of violence is senseless. It doesn't make rational sense. It doesn't make moral sense. What is the sense of it? The sense of it is expressing a darkness in the shadow which resides, as it were, uneasily in some dark corner of the unconscious. It resides very far from what I'm going to call the concerns of the soul. It involuntarily and autonomously percolates up through what I call the unconscious ego self, and then can burst into consciousness and take over our actions unless we have a very, very strong intervention. Now, the intervention ultimately is in the realm of soul. Ultimately is in the realm of soul. So what Hillman argues is that the connection with soul is the best antidote to loss of soul and all the things that loss of soul can propose. In Western culture, especially I'll say in Judeo-Christian tradition, we're not as influenced by Islam here, but I would say in the Islamic tradition, in Eastern traditions, one of the antidotes to the darkness is a moral code. This is why in my teachings, I don't start with the soul, because many people are in such trouble that they're not living by an honor code. Meaning if the core of an honor code, first of all, is not to commit harm, that is the core of morality. What I've discovered that people in their relationships cause harm all the time, usually through their words. Not to say the harm of violence that we see. I'm much more concerned because of my role. I'm not a politician. I'm not a public official who can devise policy. My role is taking care of the souls of people who are in our community. That's what I teach about. And if we can reduce the amount of again, involuntary harm that we do through our own anger at each other, our own criticizing, complaining, escalating things through senseless defensiveness, and live rational lives, conscious regulation, then we can get to the world of the soul. So the entire wisdom works that I teach, virtue, rationality, inner regulation, is all in service of the soul. But you can't be loyal to your soul. You can't live a life of soul if your consciousness is continuously being hijacked by forces that push meaning and purpose out of our lives, including a commitment to love, including a commitment to justice, and I think in interpersonal lives, it's fairness and not causing harm. An inner meaning to beauty, and in this context, it would be creating beautiful lives, to create moments with each other, that the fair description of the moment would be a moment of beauty, a beautiful moment. When we use this regarding a human being, when we say a beautiful human being, we're hardly ever referring to some kind of external quality. We're talking about some kind of internal grace. And when we talk about truth, truth here does not mean a statement connects to an empirical reality. We talk about what it means to be a true and authentic human being. So for me, these are all the concerns of the soul. And when we protect the soul is through virtue, rationality, inner regulation, so we can eventually get to depth and protect depth through a moral framework that makes sure whatever is happening inside of us, in whatever way the shadow begins to percolate, is the honor code that keeps you in the framework. No matter what the darkness wants, no matter if the darkness begins to push out the concerns of the soul, the honor code keeps you safe until you can come to your senses and then have the soul reassert itself. Now, as a necessary preface, I probably need to repeat a month or so because I always have to remind people my concern with virtue, etc., is rooted in my concern for the soul. Now, in my Torah thought that I've been developing over the years, and I hope you don't mind that I refine these thoughts year after year after year, so they'll eventually be included in a book of my interpretations of the Parsha. I have several interpretations of each Parsha as we go along, and hopefully one day this will become a book form. I'm very fond of Shakespeare's Hamlet, and it wasn't until I read Hamlet, by the way, that I did not know the savage irony of this term, to thine own self be true. I had heard it since I was a kid. I thought it was very profound, and then you find out who said it. Now, when people ascribe it to Shakespeare, it sounds like Shakespeare's being a philosopher. So I never say, as Shakespeare said. I said, as Shakespeare said through the Polonius, the pedantic buffoon said, to thine own self be true. So Shakespeare meant it in an ironic sense of someone who, from what we can see in the play, has no sense of self, has no sense of authenticity. All he has are slogans. All he has are statements. And our society is filled with this, that under 2 or 3 questions of examination, the statement falls apart. It doesn't have meaning. So what I have discovered and by the way, Socrates is the greatest model for this. What did Socrates find out? Someone says, I know about virtue. I know about piety. I know about beauty. Socrates would say, great, because I really don't understand what these words mean. May I ask you a few questions? Which, of course, eventually led to his execution. Because when you start to ask somebody, what does this exactly mean? And they haven't thought it through. And then when you start to ask, they just change the field of discussion, and they change the field of discussion, and they change the field of discussion. You realize you're not getting anywhere. And then sometimes what develops in that other person is a rage at their interlocutor because they realize their own shallowness. So, we live in a time where where sloganeering is such a deep part of our discourse. It distresses me because, as you know, slogans impede thought. So when I reflect on to thine own self be true, that Shakespeare puts in the mouth of Polonius, who has no sense of authentic self, of course, that's a beautiful introduction to our Parsha, because when we ask to our own self be true, you ask yourself, as I try to communicate here, to which self? To the self waiting for me over the horizon? To the authentic self trying to be born, that I'm preventing from being born because I won't be honest with myself? So here's something we can take for granted as we grow out of adolescence. When we come out of adolescence, we have developed a protective shield around the authentic self. In spiritual psychology, there's a very severe term. It's called the big lie. It's something we say about ourselves so we don't have to look at ourselves. And then ideally, when one moves past adolescence, one can, as it were, strip away at the very natural and probably developmentally required prevarications of the ego self and the ego mind, and you work toward a path of authenticity. The tragic thing, of course, is unless one consciously and willfully works toward discovering the authentic self, and I believe pushed by somebody, oftentimes the problems we face at 30 will still be facing at 50. I just want to give you a brief example. A person asked for my counsel upon hearing one of my podcasts and said that they were having trouble with their adult children, who this person described the behavior, asked for a police report, and said all they want is money. I'm very distressed to say. The person said they insult me, they call me names, they're disrespectful to me, but then they ask me to pay their bills. And the person said, well, what do I do? How do I solve this? And I said, well, let's go into the depth of, what are you afraid of? It's obvious. Well, I'm afraid that if I say no to them, they won't love me. So here's the bad news. They don't love you now. Anybody who insults you, disparages you, calls you names, whatever that is not a language of love. And therefore, I said, how long has this been going on? He said, well, since they were teenagers. It's now about 15 years later. And he said, I said, well, what are you doing about it? He says, well, I've been in therapy for about 10 years. And again, it was heartbreaking. And he said, my therapist is a refuge. I get to talk about these things. I don't have anybody else to talk about. I can't talk about it with my ex-wife. My friends don't want to hear about it anymore. I feel very alone. And at least in those sessions, I feel a safe place just to, metaphorically cry on someone else's shoulder. I said, I'm really glad you have that. I'm really glad you have a refuge. But how I understand wisdom work, and this reminds me of my Hasidic teacher, Jonathan Omerman, Jonathan was not my therapist. Jonathan was a person who pushed me so hard inside, it felt like the shell around my authenticity was just being ripped apart. You don't have the sense of, you don't have forever to find the authentic self and become an authentic human being. This is part of Hasidic psychology. This is, as it were, by the way, I began my work with Jonathan in the same year that I read In Search, about 1982. So that was the method that I was trained in, is the job of the Hasidic counselor, and I translate this in a secular way over to wisdom work, is to insistently push at the truth. So Jacob is a great metaphor for the archetypal psychological image of the divided self. So that's every single person here. Now, let's talk about the starting place of Jacob. And remember, the point of archetypal psychology is you have a soul, there are concerns of the soul, and that something in the soul, there's great fragmentation, as we spoke about during the high holidays. One who has to accept the fragmentation of the soul, accept the idea that one has unconsciously cultivated the big lie, as it were, which means the prevarications that stop you from inquiring into one's own inner breakage, because discovering one's own inner breakage is so painful, but it's a necessary pain that we have to go through. So in every character of the Bible that we study is a representation of the self. And this is what creates the archetypal psychological study of the Bible. It's not about people that happened then, whether it's fictional, historical, or somewhere in between. That's not why we study it from an archetypal point of view. The reason we study it from an archetypal point of view is because these personages in the Bible live in every one of us. So as we study these biblical stories in their depth, and we bring our depth to the story, you might say there becomes a symbiotic connection between our souls and the soul of the Bible. Now, what's it called when we bring our meanings, as it were, to these characters? We call that midrash. Now, there's a canonical literature of the rabbis bringing themselves into the text. The text speaks to them, they speak into the text, and there's a sense of the divine in this conversation of the people of Israel with the text. So when we study the Bible, we're not reading. I think I shared one time, a person wanted to study Bible with me. I said, well, let's study the Joseph story. The next time I met the person, he said, well, I read it over. I actually was alarmed. I said, what do you mean you read it over? Well, you told me to start in chapter 37 to 50, so I read it over. I remember thinking to myself, wow, that is actually not how it's done. What's done is you go word by word, and you break your heart in every word. Because in every word in these holy texts contain angels and souls and universes that name the angels and souls and universes in each one of us. So I realized the idea of reading, which means let me read this as a short story. I love short stories, by the way. I discovered a book of short stories that someone gave me 15 years ago. I read it a bit over Thanksgiving. I thought, wow, this is a really good book. But it was nice short stories. But there was depth to these stories. So it's not as if I could read the story and put it away. I read the story and I thought of every step of the story, what was the person getting at from a soul perspective? I'll just give you a tiny example. In the one short story that I read, a woman comes home and finds that her husband has taken the dining room table out of the dining room and put it in the backyard and says, I think it belongs there. And then this discussion of the dining room table, and it becomes deeper and deeper and deeper. And she says in the story, I'm paraphrasing, I was so concerned that the table would get ruined, that the rain would affect it, that the wood would become brittle and buckle, that the foliage would grow up and contain the table, that the table would sink into the earth. And then the person says, that's the best thing that could happen to anything that I own. So the end of the story, of course, was this really, kind of a lacerating statement. I had to read the whole thing again, and it led me into a very deep soul experience. So, a core Jewish path into the soul is the act of reading literature, deep literature, great literature, and the literature that unites us is the literature of the Bible. So if someone is here is saying, well, how do I cultivate the soul? For the purposes of a spiritual community, you have to study the Bible, not read the Bible, but study it, study the Midrash, and create your own Midrash. This is the entrance to the soul. This is how we discuss the soul as a community who has a collective unconscious, a collective dream that we all study together. So back to the original position of Jacob. So I think of Jacob, the son of Isaac, and therefore we have to think about Isaac. So we have to go into what we'll call generational trauma. Now, the reason I'm mentioning it is it's part of an archetype. This might be part of your story. It might not be part of your story. You might be Rivka. Maybe you don't carry the overt generational trauma. But what Rebecca discovered is her husband did. Maybe it's not you. Maybe it's somebody else. Maybe it's a friend, somebody that inherits, again, archetypally what Isaac inherited was that his father tried to kill him. Now, if you look at psychological literature, the idea that a parent wants to annihilate the child is a common problem. How does a parent annihilate a child? A parent annihilates a child by making the child an extension of their ego. That the child has to do and not do things, be and not be things, to please the ego sense of the parent. Because if the child didn't, the parent's sense of stability, sense of safety would be destabilized. So many parents use their children, guide their children, advise their children, coerce their children in order that the child live out the ego fantasies of the parent. This is called annihilation. So in psychological literature, the idea is the child actually never had a self. They had one of two options, basically: accommodate and please the parent because they felt so powerless that they had to submit, or defy and act out in destructive ways. Now, many people find a middle ground. They're able to keep enough of the parent out. They don't engage in destructive behavior, and they're allowed to develop into into a spiritually and morally sound person. It takes work. I think it takes guidance. So I think of Isaac, as it were, the man whose father tried to kill him. This is an archetype. Rivka, of course, marries the man. In my sense of Rivka, we're not talking about Rivka today. She's one of my favorite characters to talk about. She marries into the family of inherited trauma. Now, we don't know, was she a healing agent? Was she not? It's very hard to tell. What happens with Rivka, of course, is at the beginning of the parsha that Abigail just read, Rivka feels this inner pain and discovers she has twins. Now, again, this is an archetype, meaning completely oppositional forces inside of you that's not going to resolve itself. Jung would call this a complex. Many different things going on that don't have any resolution, and any truth that you can discover is not going to clearly lead to some kind of immediate psychological growth. So think of Rivka as the person that says, I have great inner pain. I don't know what's happening inside of you. She goes to the oracle, and the oracle says, there are two nations within you. One nation against the other nation. We might call this two ways of being as a human being. Something very obscure, that the older will serve the younger. That doesn't tell us exactly what to do, but Rivka keeps this private knowledge to herself. And now the question is, as she looks at her two sons, Jacob and Esau is the firstborn, so at this level we should say Esau and Jacob, does she tell them? She has a terrible secret. And this is another archetype. And I think this is a classic archetype of a parent, by the way. Parents, and we're talking about a thoughtful, spiritually sound parent, knows things about the child that the child doesn't know. If you told the child the truth about themselves as they're trying to develop, it would devastate the child. Sometimes a parent cannot tell the truth to the child. One can live in such a way where the child discovers the truth. And in my mind, the ideal parent gently guides the child as the child goes through one experience after another. This is where you go back to Hillman. It's where events become experiences, where children go through things. I'm talking about all the way to adult children. The job of the parent, I think, ideally, is to help that translate that event into an experience, which means I understand what happened. I understand how you responded. What did it mean to you? Meaning, not what did you do, but what kind of person did you become through that? It has to be done in the most gentle fashion. And then sometimes the child reflects and says, I don't think I understood what was really happening. I don't think I understood them. I don't think I understood myself. And now that I've reflected, I've taken a step as a human being. And sometimes our children have looked up and said, but you knew this, didn't you? We say, yeah, we knew it, but you had to discover it. We couldn't tell it to you, because if we told you, it's a sense where one has to have the heart open to the truth. And the best way to open a heart to the truth is the gentle guidance. And this is the great mistake that many parents make, and people make to each other, is we confuse advice with teaching. We confuse advice, telling people the truth, which is the soul guide, the sounding board that gently brings a person to the truth. Now remember, we have our subjective understanding of truth. We have to be very, very careful. But let's say objectively, you're a bit further along in the spiritual path. You see somebody stuck. Well, you have the option of advising, telling them off. Or you have the option of gentle leading, as it were, elucidating, bringing out a truth through reflective life experience. So I see Rebecca as this archetype. She looks at this situation, and it's clear to her that Esau is not qualified to be the inheritor of the covenant. Jacob theoretically is qualified, but he is an ishtam, you might say, an untouched person dwelling in his tent. Partly, and again, this is an interpretation of Jacob. Jacob knows there's something wrong in his family. His father is blind, which I think is a metaphor to the blindness of the situation. Jacob knows the horrible thing that his father went through. The Midrash asks, how did Isaac become blind? when his father tied him up on the altar and took out the knife, the angels cried tears that seeped into the eyes of Isaac and made him blind. And the angel, of course, comes at the last moment and stays the hand of Abraham. But the father was wounded. The father is traumatized. And maybe Jacob realizes whatever this man is, whatever he's done, whatever covenant he's inherited, he can't father anybody. He's been traumatized. He's been fixed in a position that does not allow him to grow. Now, this is our wondering what it must have been to be the son whose response to life was to be an untouched person in the tent. Why would a person do that? Why would a person say, I don't want to go outside my tent. I don't want to feel anything. I don't want to say anything because the truth is too difficult. Okay? He looked at his brother and he knows about the covenant. He knows about the covenant of Abraham to Isaac. And he knows what's at stake is the leadership of inheriting this covenant. And he looks at his brother Esau and says, this is all going to be destroyed. He's going to run the thing into the ground. But that's what people do. You know, the elder shall inherit. He's the Bechor. He's the older brother. And there's nothing I can do. I can't talk anybody out of it. So Jacob is there. Esau thinks he has it, but the sense is that Esau is not developed enough to comprehend it, and then Rebekah has to take action. And when Rebekah takes action, we have a sense that she imparted a bit of it to Jacob, because one day when Esau comes home from the hunt and wants some of the red stew that Jacob makes, Jacob says, I'll give you some soup for the birthright. Esau sells it to him. There's this moment between them where the truth has finally been uncovered. So what we see is in that moment, and again, it's one of my favorite tiny little pieces of narrative in the Bible, when Esau sells his birthright, it's a moment of acknowledging the truth, the painful acknowledging the truth. The brothers see it in each other, and then Esau retreats from the moment. So in some sense, Jacob has this terrible dilemma. How do I make things right? How do I put things in their so-called ideal natural order when my father and my brother won't see it? Of course, Rivka intervenes, and she says to Jacob, you'll have to do this unseemly thing. And Abigail, it's later in our parsha today, where Rivka guides Jacob to go to his father and utter a blatant lie, to be an imposter, to impersonate his brother. And in the exchange that goes on, when this happens, we're looking at it and we ask ourselves, is this a valid communication of the birthright? If Jacob lied to get the blessing from his father, is it valid? Now, this is another deep archetype of the yearning for the blessing. And again, this can take us very far afield, but it's important that we ask ourselves, if you could get a blessing from anyone, who would that person be? And what would they say? And how would that blessing change your life? If you could get a blessing from anyone, who would that person say? Who would that person be? What would they say? And how would it change your life? Put differently, you might say, who has withheld the blessing? And why have they withheld the blessing? And what has your life meant having had that blessing withheld? And then what does one do? The blessing has been withheld from Jacob as Jacob, but Jacob and Rebekah have extracted the blessing out of Isaac. And then, of course, poor Esau comes home and finds out what has happened. And in one of the most pathos-evoking moments of the Bible is in chapter 27, verse 32. Genesis 27, 32. I'll go back to verse 30. When Isaac finished blessing Jacob, and Jacob had barely left, Esau came back from the hunt. Now, many people say Esau is unqualified because he's a hunter. But if you go back and look at Yishmael, who's going to become Esau's father-in-law, by the way, because Esau does marry a daughter of Yishmael. Yishmael is a man of the bow, and God blesses Yishmael and promises to be with Yishmael. So in many ways, Esav is archetypally similar to Ishmael, who is a son of Abraham and blessed by God. So I don't buy it that either Ishmael or Esav are somehow have antipathy toward God, or God has antipathy toward them. You might say Esav is the archetype, just as Jacob is in the tent, Esav is in the field. So when one sees these two opposing brothers, of course, the whole human being is Jacob and Esav united, which we see in next week's Torah portion. So I don't buy it that Esav is bad any more than Jacob is bad. There are two different parts of the fragmented self that have to be pulled together, just as we have to discover the alienated parts of ourselves that have to be integrated. So in this moment, he says, let my father rise and eat the game that you've sent me out to get. And Isaac, his father, says to him, who are you? And he says, I'm your firstborn Esau. This is the truth. And then it says, Isaac trembled in great perplexity. This tells me that Isaac had not known about what was going on. Rebekah had not told him. Rebekah probably thinking that Isaac could not handle the truth, that just as what happened, when you were a kid, that Ishmael was banished and nearly killed, nearly died in the desert because God preferred you, it's happening again. And my sense, I've said this many times, Rivka felt if she would tell Isaac, Isaac would say, not on my watch. This is not happening again. What my parents did to me, I'm not doing to my children. Okay. However that gets worked out, I'm not going to do what God and my father and my mother did to my half-brother Ishmael. Remember, at the end of last week's Torah portion, it seems that Isaac and Ishmael have completely reconciled, and that Isaac has gone to live with Ishmael's mother, Hagar, at Be'er Lachai Roi. So there's some kind of great reconciliation between Isaac and Ishmael. In my mind, Isaac could not have heard this. It was a truth too painful to bear. It's a truth too painful to bear. So what happens with Isaac in this great moment of pathos in the Bible? Isaac says, I've blessed him, and this is a moment of Isaac coming to consciousness, and he's going to remain blessed. Now, there's a flash of a moment when he realized what he has done. He realizes he's been avoiding the truth, that Esau at this point in his life is unqualified, Jacob is, and that he's been perpetuating a lie. And in that very moment, in a flash, Isaac understands the truth. And he says, I just blessed Jacob, and Jacob's going to stay blessed. Saying the hardest thing, because remember, previously it says, Isaac loved Esau. It tells that Isaac loved Rebekah. That's very profound and important. And then it says, Isaac loved Esau. And he looks at this child, and it says, Rebekah loved Jacob. So Isaac is looking at this son, whom he loves, and he has to inflict the most painful hurt that is imaginable in this story. Esau heard his father's words, and then it says in chapter 34, I'll quote it to you, Kishmoa Esav et divrei avi vayitzak tza'aka gedola umara ad me'od. This is very powerful Hebrew. Hebrew is such a laconic language. When it says, and he screamed out, he shouted out, a great shout, a great cry, and bitter, ad me'od, a deep and bitter and great cry, and vayomer la'aviv, and he says to his father, in this deep and bitter and great cry, barcheni gam ani avi, oh my father, bless me too. So this is one of the most, I think, a moment of such deep pathos, of deep feeling, of excruciating pain that you can find in the Bible. And again, from an archetypal perspective, and I hope I'm not taking this too far, what is your tza'aka gedolah? Something like a primal scream therapy. When you look in yourself, now perhaps in life you've already gone far beyond this. You did your primal scream 10, 20, 30 years ago. But maybe you haven't. Maybe you haven't uttered your tza'aka gdola mara ad me'od, the bitterness of a truth that you just have to scream into life. And perhaps you have uttered it. And perhaps in your solitude, your hitbo to do it, you need to utter it again. And this is where, in a moment where I see the authenticity of Esav. He doesn't say, that blessing is mine. He doesn't say, it belongs to me. What he says is, Vayomer la'aviv, barcheni gam ani. It says, Esav understands, I get it. It's his blessing. You're right. This has been the terrible family secret we've all avoided. But isn't there anything left over for me? So this is a moment, one of the most powerful moments of the Bible, where everybody for a moment sees the truth. Everybody sees the truth, including Isaac, including Esav, including Jacob, including Rebekah. I mean, the archetypal depth of these few sentences is truly amok ad me'od. It's very, very deeply profound. And then Isaac reflects, I'm reading from the English now, your brother clave with cleverness and took your blessing. And Esav says, that's why he's called Jacob. He outwitted me these 2 times. It goes back to the birth, when Yaakov means that he had the ekev of his brother Esav, and then crowded, and so when Esav was born, Jacob was at his heel, in the sense that his entire life, Jacob has been at his heel. Esav does receive a so-called lesser blessing. And now the point where I'll end, which is verse 41. Now, this moment of clarity that Esav had, Barcheni gamani avi, my father, please also bless me. Esav has stepped back from that moment. And this is also a profoundly archetypal moment. I don't know if you've had these moments, I've had them, where one day I wake up and I look at my life and all the things that I've done and all the things that I have to do, and something becomes super clear to me. And for me, it's cultivating a kind of a consciousness. And I say to myself, yes, this is it. Today's the turning point. And then I get on with my day. And it usually happens on Shabbat when I start to contemplate, and I said, I just remembered the clarity I had last Shabbat and I lost it. And I say to myself, okay, this is it. I'm clear. It's super clear. And it stays with me, and I go to my classes, and then I realize, oh, I forgot what it was. And this is one reason it's so profound for me to just keep reading books like this book that I've been reading since 1982. Just by studying Hillman, I've worn out two prior copies. This is a relatively new one. By reading Hillman, just by reading Hillman telling the listener, the reader, you've lost your soul, it makes me stop for a moment and say, I think I lost my soul too. I have to find my soul. So these kinds of stories, we see Esav, suddenly it says, and Esav harbored hatred toward Jacob. Esav backed away from the truth, and his response was hatred. I want to leave the story here because now we see that things have fallen apart. That Esav intends to murder his brother. Rebekah, who loves Jacob, realized, I got to get my son out of town. And in those days, there's no mail, there's no telephones, there's no email. It means she might never see her son again. So she had to give up a deep and profound bond in order to save her son. And who would remain behind? Her son with a bitter and broken heart. He's the one that would stay behind. And therefore, I imagine, I've said this many times, I call this the Midrash of Rebekah. And I was thinking about it this morning before I talked. I've been mentioning it for years, but I really deeply want to try to outline for myself what would happen in the intervening years. And I believe this had to be Rebekah. Or in next week's Torah portion, Esav would give to Jacob the greatest blessing imaginable, and then the two brothers would be reconciled. When you read the story of Jacob, this is not what Jacob was doing. Jacob was living in fear, getting ready for a confrontation, getting ready for a war, not knowing that the 20 years that Jacob was living in this kind of fear for the confrontation, Esau was actually the one who tried to work things through. So the moment they met, Esau, in my mind, becomes one of the most heroic characters in the Bible. And we'll talk about that next week. This concludes my talk for today.